Hi everyone. We made an extra video on the anatomy of the central nervous system, since there wasn't enough time to cover up the basics of neuroanatomy in 3 videos. This video is divided into 2 segments. First, we will take a look into the cerebellum. Then we will explore the major components of the spinal cord. Starting this video with the cerebellum. On this lateral view, we can see that the cerebellum is situated behind the brainstem. Its weight is about 10% that of the cerebrum, and thus it's called the little brain. It contains within an extensive folds and fissures, helping in increasing the surface area. The cerebellum is connected to the brainstem via an axons connecting each part of the brainstem to the cerebellum. These axons are the superior, the middle and inferior cerebellar peduncles. When we take a look in a posterior view of the brainstem, we find the superior cerebellar peduncle in red, the middle cerebellar peduncle in blue, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle in green color. Superior cerebellar peduncle has an afferent and efferent fibers or axons into and from the cerebellum. Middle cerebellar peduncle has only afferent fibers from the pons to the cerebellum, while the inferior cerebellar peduncle, just like the superior, has afferent and efferent fibers. The primary fissure divides the cerebellum into an anterior and posterior lobe. There is another lobe which could not be visualized from this lateral view. The cerebellum is facing the opposite direction of the brain and the body. So in an anterior view of the cerebellum, we would be looking into the back of the body, while in a posterior view, we would be facing the body. So in an anterior view, we could see that the cerebellum has 2 hemispheres, just like the brain. In the central part of the cerebellum, between the 2 hemispheres, we find the vermis, which is subdivided into 10 lobules. In a posterior view of the cerebellum, once we remove the brainstem, we find the cerebellar peduncles, the vermis in the middle, the posterior and anterior lobes of the cerebellum. Just below the cerebellar peduncles, we find the 3rd lobe only visible in a posterior view. It's called the flocculonodular lobe. Now in this anterior view of the cerebellum, if we made a cut and removed the outer layers of the cerebellum, we see here the outer layer, which is the cerebellar cortex. In the middle, we find a white matter making a tree-looking like shape called the arbor vitae, translates to the tree of life. Basically, it's the extension of the cerebellar peduncles. This is how it looks like. Looks beautiful, isn't it? Deep within the layer of the white matter, we find the deep cerebellar nuclei, best memorized through the sentence, "Don't eat greasy food." From lateral to medial. The deep cerebellar nuclei are: D stands for dentate nucleus, E stands for emboliform nucleus, the G stands for globose nucleus, and those together are called the interpositus nucleus. And last but not least, aligning with the level of the vermis, the fastigious or the fastigial nuclei. Functions of the cerebellum: it helps in the coordination of movement, it controls the posture and maintains the balance of the body. The cerebellum makes adjustments and predictions for better accuracy and higher movement speed with less effort. The cerebellum also helps in maintaining the muscle tone. Now we move on into the next segment of this video, in which we take a look into the spinal cord. The spinal cord is covered by 3 layers of meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid is found within the subarachnoid space, between the arachnoid and the inner layer, the pia mater. The spinal cord is divided into segments. We have 8 cervical segments, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal segment. The spinal cord is found within the vertebral column. We have 7 cervical vertebrae. The difference in number between the cervical vertebrae and the cervical segments of the spinal cord is due to the fact that the first cervical nerve leaves the spinal cord above the level of the first cervical vertebrae. So as you can see here, we have the vertebral disc, the vertebrae, and the spinal nerve leaving the spinal cord through the neuronal foramen between the vertebrae. The spinal cord is covered by the meninges for the sake of protection from nerve injury. Let's get back to the vertebral column. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal vertebrae, aligned with the number of the spinal cord segment. Now let's take a look into the lower part of the spinal cord. In adults, the spinal cord ends with the level of the first or the second lumbar vertebrae. The lower tapered end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris, typically from the first sacral segment till the end of the spinal cord. Nerve fibers leaving from the second to the fifth sacral segment are called the coda equina, translates to horse's tail because of how it looks like. There is an extension of the pia mater from the lower end of the spinal cord, which is strongly attached to the coccygeal vertebrae, called the filum terminale interna. There is also a dura and arachnoid extension reaching the third sacral segment before joining the pia mater, and it's called the filum terminale externa. And these fibers helps in stabilizing the spinal cord in place, so it won't move around and get injured by the vertebral column. As we mentioned, the cerebrospinal fluid is found within the subarachnoid space. Lumbar puncture is the insertion of needle to draw out and analyze the contents of the spinal cord, a clinical process typically done between the third and the fifth lumbar vertebrae to avoid spinal cord injury. By drawing a straight line between the two iliac crests, we can estimate for the best position when inserting the needle for lumbar puncture. Now let's make a cross-section to view the spinal cord. The spinal cord has a butterfly, H-shaped, looking like gray matter in the middle, within a layer of white matter that has ascending, descending fibers, and also fibers leaving or coming into the spinal cord. The white matter is divided into columns by the H-shaped gray matter. We have a posterior or dorsal column, lateral column in each side, an anterior or ventral column. The gray matter of the spinal cord has a dorsal horn primarily containing sensory nuclei and a ventral horn mainly composed of motor nuclei. Nerve fibers leaving the dorsal horn are sensory afferent fibers, and they have a ganglia outside of the spinal cord called the dorsal root ganglia, which is the pathway for some important sensory tracts. Fibers leaving the ventral horn are motor efferent fibers. Now these fibers join together, forming a spinal nerve. An autonomic ganglia could be found in certain spinal nerves. Now let's take a cut and see what spinal nerves are made of. Now this is our spinal nerve. It is covered by a tough outer layer of dura and arachnoid matter called the epineurium. Spinal nerve is made of nerve bundles grouped together as fascicles. Also, we find blood vessels between these fascicles. Fascicles are covered by a layer of connective tissue called the perineurium. Within the fascicles, we find the axons of the neurons. Each axon is covered by a layer of connective tissue called the endoneurium. The endoneurium contains fluid and protein, which helps in maintaining homeostasis for the neuronal cells. Now, nerve fibers or axons are either myelinated or unmyelinated fibers. Myelinated fibers, according to the degree of myelination, is divided into type A fibers and type B fibers. Type A are subdivided into alpha, beta, gamma, and delta fibers. Unmyelinated fibers, called type C fibers. Myelinated fibers are characterized by high metabolic rate, repetitive firing, and faster conduction of electricity, and hence why it is at a higher risk at states of cold, compression, and oxygen deprivation. A typical example of type C fibers are fibers that conduct pain sensation. And this is where local anesthetics works better in blocking the conduction of pain sensation before it reaches the brain. So guys, that's it for the neuroanatomy. Hope you could grasp onto the basics of the neuroanatomy and enjoyed our videos. Next we move on to the next chapter of the sensory system. Until we meet again, thanks for watching this video, and we see you in the next video.